Tech's guinea pig. Australia has always been a place where companies experiment. Domino Pizza tested delivery robots. Facebook tested something called Rooms where you can talk to strangers. They tried Tinder Social for group dates. All the bad ideas die in Australia. And my next guest is one of the leading business journalists and authors who's been following this stuff for decades. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Media Jungle Video Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ragir, coming to you every week to break down the business behind the news industry, the future of media, and the creator economy. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter and YouTube channel. Leave a review if you like this show. On this episode, we're joined by Tim Burrowes, author of Unmade, Australian media's most disruptive decade, and founder of Mumbrella, a leading media and marketing publication. You can find him on Substack. So what do the Australians think about being called the Tech's guinea pig?
Well, look, it's definitely something that I've noticed, that we're one of those kind of Goldilocks markets, I suppose. You know, we're big enough that you can try something and know whether it works or not, and small enough that if you're a global player, it doesn't ruin everything, and you may be just off Broadway enough. So you do see these experiments, as you've alluded to, we sometimes see the social media players try things differently. I write, as well as writing about the media world, I write about the advertising and marketing world, and you certainly see some of the big consultancies try new models here, where they dip their toe into that advertising world to see if it's a world for them. And then you see them roll it out on the global stage.
What the media landscape is like in Australia and how it's different from the US or England or other places, so we get a kind of lay of the land.
I suppose the first thing that people always notice when they come to the Australian media industry is how relatively consolidated it is. So when it comes to news, the news mastheads, whether it was newspapers or online publishing, dominated by News Corp. So, obviously Australia is the original home of News Corp. We're just a few weeks away from the 50th anniversary of Rupert Murdoch taking the helm. So that is definitely underlying drumbeat. But then, in the same way in television, there are really only two or three major players when it comes to free-to-air television. So again, quite a small sort of consolidated thing. And the same really goes by medium. Something somebody once said to me about Australia is, in every industry in Australia, there's room for about 2.5 players. And that really does seem to be true in the media as well.
What does that mean for media when it's very consolidated and very centralized?
The major issue, I think, when it comes to sort of the public interest, I suppose, is that you tend not to get the diversity of voices that you might get elsewhere. There's particularly when it comes to kind of, the very mainstream media, there are a narrow range of voices, which tends to mean that the politics can become quite homogenized as well, I suppose.
And the recent kind of news or semi-recent news that they've changed the law that Facebook and Google will have to pay news publishers. It sounds really great. I know it was pushed by News Corp. It was basically them strongholding Facebook and Google. Is that as good as it sounds, or is there a lot of things you have to be wary about?
Yeah, this was such a defining moment for Australia's media, and it said so much about Australians' media. The fact that the government of the time was willing to change the law to create this news media bargaining code, which effectively meant that Facebook and Google, if they were designated, would have had to pay publishers for the right to link to their content. Now, in the end, we ended up with this grubby compromise where they were all leaned on, in the end, we had this grubby compromise where the two of them were leaned on to do deals with the publishers, really on non-commercial terms, to give them a lot of money to avoid being designated. Now, what that meant was, for the big end of town when it came to publishing, they did great because they got to do the deals. What's tended to happen, though, is there's been this sort of long tail of much smaller publishers who haven't been able to do deals, particularly with Facebook. Google have done quite a lot, Facebook not so many. So you now have this even more uneven playing field where the big publishers have this extra revenue stream coming in where, Facebook and Google are basically having to pay them a tax, but that money isn't trickling through to the smaller media companies who also want to compete in that playing field. So it's kind of imperfect. Probably puts the publishers in a certainly the big publishers in a better position than otherwise they were. But yeah, wow, it said an awful lot about the point in Australia where politics meets the media business.
Is there anything for people who are media observers or executives should know that they might be able to learn from the Australia media environment right now?
One of the big themes I think that certainly we've seen in Australia, and I suspect this is a bit of a global theme as well, because we're existing within this ecosystem where there's a pendulum. And for the last 10 years, we've seen this pendulum swing in the way that media is funded in Australia. So, for most of its history, media was funded in Australia through advertising. Whether it's free-to-air television, whether it's newspapers, etc. And that began to change a decade ago as recruitment advertising disappeared from the newspapers and went online. As streaming came through, for instance, from about 2015 onwards. So you saw this sort of change to where actually consumers choosing to subscribe, whether it was to the streaming services, your Netflix or whatever, or whether it was, to read newspapers online. And that actually became a more important revenue stream than advertising for the first time in media's history. And that was really stark in Australia. And it's also been interesting to see the pendulum just begin to swing back a little as well. As we see, hey, look, Netflix subscriptions peak and announced plans to begin having an advertising supported tier as well. So we are, I think, beginning to see this sort of new appreciation of the role of advertising in the ecosystem. And I think that's a trend that's been quite well advanced in Australia, which I'm sure we'll be seeing globally as well.
You built a B2B media company and you sold it pretty recently. Maybe you could just start from the beginning. First, why did you start Mumbrella? Was there a moment where you knew it was going to be successful?
I was involved in starting Mumbrella. I was sort of the first employee, I suppose, back in 2008. I'd been working in the trade press around the world for some time. I'd edited Media Week in the UK and had then edited a publication for the media and advertising industry in the Middle East before coming to Australia, working for a much more traditional print-based title for a couple of years before starting Mumbrella. And really it was just a moment and an opportunity where it suddenly got cheap for journalists to publish their own stuff. So if you talk to journalists, a decade before, they'd have had to mortgage their house to get the first edition of a magazine out. But now it was something you could jump online for almost nothing. Start a WordPress site. Email was just becoming cheap as well, so that sort of became a sort of extra sort of weapon. So it all kind of came through, and then tied in with social media being a way of transmitting the work that you were doing. It all came together. So it was the right moment to do something. So along with a couple of business partners, we started Mumbrella, which as you say, we sold back in 2017. We were I suppose relatively fortunate given that by then we were quite an events business, to be out before the pandemic switched off the events world.
I'm sure one of the advice you would give is to hit when the pan's hot. The good times don't always remain. I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize that. What types of advice would you give people who are building B2B media brands?
The one thing that's always struck me is when you talk to people and they tell you their plans, The ones where you get a bit of an inkling, oh, I'm not sure about this. When you think about the common factor, it's where they're not thinking about their audience. They're thinking too much about just the business model or the advertiser customers or whatever it is. So it does feel to me that media and publishing is so much an audience first thing, even when it's not necessarily the audience who's funding it. So you know, I suppose the one thing we always did was we never thought about what the end game was. And, you know, I've since started my new thing, which is Unmade.media. And again, it's about the audience. It's you write for the audience, you serve for the audience, you try new things. And, you know, we certainly tried a few things, you know, with Mumbrella that didn't work, but we were always kind of striving to fulfill some sort of need or gap in understanding for our audience. So that I personally, I think, is the single biggest thing you can do to succeed is offer some sort of, sounds really obvious, but some sort of service to your audience.
And is that more, you say, gap in understanding, that's sort of like an editorial look? Is that more editorial, or is that more like how you market to your audience? How do you get them to click or get them to engage?
Yeah, I suppose one of the natures of publishing these days is you need all of those things. So for me, the sort of the starting point, and this is probably because I'm a journalist by background, so that's where I come at it, is servicing your audience. Now, you know, every journalist does that differently depending on who the audience is. I'm a specialist journalist in the B2B world that happens to be that interesting world of media and marketing. So I'm, you know, when I'm writing something, I'm trying to write it or analyze it through the lens of offering the context and an analysis to my audience of what's important to them. But clearly you then need to pick up the skills to, you know, to market your content as well, because, you know, without that, you don't find the audience. And I think that's the sort of hidden thing, is the rules of that keep changing, of course.
How do you grow an audience when your audience is a niche business publication? How do you can't get a viral video that'll boost your audience? How do you find the people who would be interested in your content?
Well, look, social media obviously is one place that's good for tribes. You know, my experience going a second time with Unmade is, you know, Twitter is not the rocket fuel it was the first time round, you know, and we just, I think when we went last time, it was just as Twitter was coming through, and the sort of early adopters on there were the sort of people we wanted to talk to from our industry. So my instinct is that obviously LinkedIn is a great way of talking to tribes. But then the other secret weapon is email. You know, email is so important. So first and foremost, Unmade is a newsletter. It's on the Substack platform. But what that means is you have the ability to send to your audience a reminder that you exist whenever you have a piece of content. So that, you know, that is something which is incredibly valuable, because you're creating habits. You know, if you can then build the habit that people will automatically expect that when something drops in their inbox, it's going to reward their choosing to open it and click through, then those are the things where it's not just what the headline is in the email that matters, but their expectations, even subconscious, of what you've written before, that they'll get something of value or something they enjoy if they do click. So yeah, email is really great for reinforcing those habits.
Yeah. What's the secret for, what have you found has been most successful in getting those types of people to share or engage with the content, right? Because they're more of a serious, they're not just sitting there on social media commenting. You know, what types of stuff works to grow your audience through your audience?
Yeah, look, the shareable stuff is not always the stuff you think, and it's very, very rarely the stuff that you've worked hardest on, I've realised. So sometimes, you know, and sometimes where you can just underestimate is, you'll make a point, or you'll write something which you'll feel is a bit obvious. You feel like you've said it before, but you cover the ground and you lay it all out, and then it just really seems to take off, you know, so you'll suddenly see it being shared on social media or whatever it is. So I'm not sure there's one formula. And again, you know, I guess my approach has always been quite slow and steady. So, I guess I've never really written for shareability. I've kind of, written for my existing audience and hope to slowly build through word of mouth. And then it's a bonus if every now and then something kind of really does take off. But I suspect that particularly when you're writing as a specialist journalist, it's actually quite it's probably quite self-defeating to write for the clicks, because of course, if the substance isn't there as well, then the audience doesn't tend to keep coming back.
When selling your the media brand, how what's kind of the process you go through when you're looking? You have to decide if you want to sell. You have to actively start talking to people. How did that process play out?
So this was a process which it took a long time, and we weren't certain of what the outcome would be. As I mentioned before, I had a couple of other business partners. One of whom I worked with in the business, and another one was, effectively a silent investor. And over the years, he hadn't had much of a return because it had always tended to, reinvest what we brought into the business in growth. So it sort of became a point where it would be fair to find an exit for him. So that was where we kind of went into the process, and we actually brought in somebody who leads these processes to kind of guide us through it. And it was very much finding a way of telling our story. You need a vision for where you're going to go next, and then seeing who's out there. And then you realize that every conversation you have with every potential partner or acquirer or whatever it ends up being is different. And if it comes to the point where they put something on the table, they all structure it differently as well. So you have to think about what looks right for you and your life going forward. So as I say, I sold in the end of 2017, and I could have stayed. I was obliged to stay for 2 years, but I chose to stay for about 4 because it worked for me. I was the acquirers made it easy to stay longer, all of those things. So an awful lot is when someone sells is about what they, what they want from their life going forward. But also, of course, some people, I suppose, are successful at building a business with the intention of how they'll get their exit at the other end. But I've never been very good at that. So that exit crept up on us a little bit, and it was a good exit, but it wasn't always the plan.
Let's talk a little bit about your book, Unmade. It breaks down the decade from 2010 to 2020 in Australia's media landscape. Maybe you could kind of give us a high-level overview, catch us up on what happened over that decade from your book, and also how that might have some relation to what's happening in the U.S.
I guess the idea occurred for the book. I suppose the timing was actually possibly even before the pandemic started, but I just had this thought that we'd had this really interesting decade, if you can call 2010 to 2021, I guess it's a 12-year decade. So I kind of wanted to tell the story of how Australia's media had got there, which is obviously a global story as well, because, there are plenty of global players here in Australia too. And then so much of it once the publisher accepted the idea, that was how the book Media Unmade came about. And then the hardest thing was actually finding a way of telling that story that wasn't really dry and textbook. So I ended up sitting just to my left of where I'm sitting in my office now, with this giant cork board on an easel where I kind of plotted along the top each medium and then down the side each year, and with tiny little bits of index paper, all of the significant events till I had maybe 200 events. And then, honestly, it was, I guess maybe what I hadn't appreciated is there's a lot of structure building before you write a word. And then off to my right, I had a whiteboard where I tried to create effectively a 3-act structure, just like you would for a fictional story, to kind of tell all of the interconnecting stories. And that's the thing, in Australia, like anywhere else, there are so many interconnecting stories where you'll have the Murdoch family, and you'll have, Lachlan Murdoch leaving the company and going off and starting his own business where, he ends up running a very successful radio network in Australia before coming back to the family. And by then, the purchases he'd helped News Corp make in real estate publishing was what was making the company safe, and so on. So you had so many sort of strands and themes that it was really a question of finding ways of telling those stories and making the most of the fact that I'd been reporting them myself.
What's the wrong way to tell those types of stories, historical stories?
I think one of the risks is it's such an interesting world. So not to get lost in the dryness of the numbers, to find a way of using those numbers to illustrate a wider point. And, often, numbers are a great way of telling a story. And
Give us a few points from the book that you've sort of thought through.
I suppose a few of the sort of themes that came through, and one of them we've talked about already, is the pendulum. Absolutely, the book. And it's one of those things, it's only when you sit down and look at the trends that you really realise what was coming through. So it was in the process of writing the book that I really realised we'd seen this sort of pendulum swing away from advertising-supported media to consumer pays media, whether it was on video streaming or news. So that was one. Another key one, which definitely a trend we've seen repeated in the UK, maybe not so much in the US, but maybe you can tell me that, is public service broadcasting being under threat. So we've certainly seen the trend here in Australia, and at a distance I've observed it in the UK as well, where whenever you tend to have a right-leaning government, they tend to be quite confrontational with the public service broadcaster, particularly when they do news, and that funding ends up under threat. So that was a theme. We get, I guess one of the sad things is, as we speak in 2022, the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, has never been weaker, really. There's recently been a change of government in Australia who have given a bit more funding, but one of the great Australian cultural institutions has really been weakened over the last few years. So that has been a real trend of kind of confrontation, and you've got this, and you can't rule out News Corporation or News Corp's role in that, because News Corp has traditionally been quite sceptical or hostile towards public service broadcasting around the world, and then of course often tends to have the ear, particularly of when governments lead to the right. So you have this kind of what I describe in the book as the thruple from hell in News Corp and the government and the ABC, where there's just this really dysfunctional relationship between the three of them.
Is there any silver lining you can leave us with?
I think the way in the way the book told the story, I guess our ending, as much as it was this news media bargaining code coming through, and suddenly guaranteeing the certainly short-term and medium-term funding of journalism from the big end of town. So, it was kind of a happy. It was a complex and grubby happy ending, but it was kind of a happy ending.
Well, thank you so much. We'll leave it there, Tim. You can buy Tim's book, Unmade, Australian Media's Most Disruptive Decade. You can also find Tim at the Unmade Substack. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. Please like and subscribe so the YouTube algorithm will show our videos to more people. Also join our Substack newsletter for exclusive updates, or if you're on the go, find us wherever you listen to your audio podcasts. Click on one of the links to find our next video, and also check out the links below for more information. Thanks so much for watching.